Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. I'm very much obliged to the Bureau and the Conveners Committee for making time available for this committee debate. I may indulge your indication there's a little bit of slack time in this debate by occasionally stopping to restart my voice, and I have the glass of water beside me should that prove to be necessary. My apologies to anybody who feels inconvenienced by the tone of my voice. It is entirely to do with something not under my control. The word lobbying can have negative connotations of deals done behind closed doors. But the starting point for the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee's inquiry is that lobbying is a legitimate, valuable and necessary part of informing a healthy democracy. The more voices that feed into the Parliament, the more informed we will be to scrutinise, to legislate, to develop new policy. On that basis, lobbying should be actively encouraged. We are founded on principles including openness and accessibility, and the committee is clear that nothing the Parliament does in response to proposals for change should inhibit our engagement with Civic Scotland. But it needs to be clear what and who has influenced decision-making. It's the who, what, who knows, who's affected of lobbying that matters. The committee's work was initiated in the context of the introduction of a bill at Westminster and also of Neil Finlay's proposal to establish a statutory register of lobbyists. Helen Eadie was the acting convener at that time of the committee, and as ever, we are grateful for her contribution as a parliamentarian to our committees and to the subject that's before us today. The committee has taken a great deal of evidence. We're extremely grateful to all witnesses and those who've submitted written views. And many of the people who have been involved in that process are with us in the public gallery this afternoon, and I'm delighted to see that continuing engagement with the committee's activities, because they're not for the committee, they're not for Parliament alone. The convener will do so, Mr Finlay.
Neil Finlay.
Can I ask the convener why the committee undertook its investigation and who prompted that?
Well, as I say, when Helen Eadie was acting convener at the point when Dave Thompson was unwell, the decision was made by the committee. It was requested by a range of people, but the committee itself is master of its work, and under Helen Eadie's leadership decided that we should do this. I would say, just personally, that it may be a weakness of mine to think the best of people, but I've always thought that as an MSP we must defend us against the worst, and I hope today's debate makes a contribution to our all getting to that point. Now, if you wish, yes.
Neil Finlay.
Can I ask the convener if the committee, whether he as convener or the previous convener, was asked by the government to have an inquiry into this?
The government are very keen that we should do this, but they were not the only ones who were taking an interest in the subject, and the important thing is to be aware the committee itself could decide what it would do, and the committee on a cross-party basis agreed to do it. Now, I'm going to make some progress, but I will welcome further interventions on the substance of what I'm going to say. The important thing is that this is a matter of huge relevance for us, and in coming to Parliament today, we thought it important, before we come to our conclusions and publish them, to take the temperature of members and beyond the Parliament. Our inquiry set out to investigate whether there was an issue with undue influence or access to politicians in Scotland. The good news for MSPs is that we received no evidence of a scandal on the horizon about lobbying in Scotland. The evidence we did hear from a diverse range of views painted a broadly positive picture. But, and it's an important but, even if everything is fine, are we providing enough information to others that enables them to decide that that is the case? With additional powers coming to this Parliament, there may be the need for additional safeguards. And in any event, we have to revisit our rules and make sure that they are prepared for what may come in the future in the way of challenge. Many witnesses in particular were critical of recent Westminster changes, and I'm sure that will feature in the debate. The UK legislation on lobbying was not held in high regard by a good number of our witnesses. It was described as a sham by one, and another said that they hoped it would be repealed. We have an opportunity to think calmly and collectively about whether and how to change the lobbying regime in Scotland, and also what the pros and cons of tightening the rules on lobbying would be. We found that a good question to get the debate started in committee was who should the onus be on in making details of lobbying activity public. Should the onus be on the lobbyist, the person being lobbyist, and that will include many of us, most of us, all of us, or should it be on both? Plenty of people consider that politicians and senior officials should make their diaries public, which in practice would mean publishing details of contacts with lobbyists. Others suggested that I will indeed.
I thank the member for giving way. I mean, I've not been involved in this myself, but when I saw this suggestion of publicising our diaries, I mean, I personally would be happy to do that, but I think there are some individuals and groups who come to me confidentially would be quite nervous about their details being in the public domain.
The member makes a perfectly proper point. I will develop that a little bit later in my remarks. Others who came to the committee suggested there was no substitute for a register of lobbyists. It could simply be a complementary measure, the publishing of diaries. However you capture lobbying activity, the first question has to be, what is lobbying? Now, that sounds like a simple question, but the answer is one of the most contested in political science. The temptation is to go for a very simple wording, something like, lobbying is contact with a person in public office in an attempt to influence. Now, that sounds very straightforward. But what form of contact should be included? And doesn't that definition make just about everybody you come across in your working life as a politician or lobbyist? If I, on my train journey home tonight, end up talking about public policy to somebody sitting in an adjacent seat, would I have to register it using that definition? Politicians make contact with people in many ways. To name a few, we're emailed briefings for chamber debates, we're phoned, tweeted, Facebook messaged, we meet people in cross-party groups and at events inside this building and in our constituencies. And we meet people by absolute happenstance. Getting even more complicated, we read in the media about research and grassroots campaigns, some of which are begun by third parties, the names of which sometimes deliberately receive no coverage at all. Which elements of these types of contact could be captured in a lobbying register? And if we go for a register, who should be required to register? Some approaches in other countries just require consultant lobbyists to register. But the evidence we received suggested that so much of modern lobbying activity is in-house, meaning that just registering consultant lobbyists would not capture enough. And I think there would be agreement about that. Other witnesses suggested that in-house lobbying was hard to capture, as lobbying is incorporated into communication strategies and into the day jobs of people with multifaceted roles. Now, it should be noted that there was not, in our witnesses and those who responded to our consultation, a lack of willingness to make activities public. Lots of organisations made clear that they already publicise information, not least to demonstrate to the outside world, their customers and stakeholders, the value of their work. There are also regulatory requirements for charities and for others to adhere to, which require information to be published. Unions will wish to highlight the fruits of their labours to their members and to others. A number of public affairs organisations publish voluntary registers and have relevant codes of conduct. It's often the logistics of how our registration system would work that was the focus of concern. Some suggested that systems that exempt groups based on size, purpose, amount of lobbying activity or income, or that place thresholds on when to register lobbying activity, could be problematic, as exceptions can create unforeseen loopholes and unintended consequences. Another approach would be a sliding scale of information required, proportionate to the size of the organisation. For example, it could require some organisations, like full-time consultant lobbyists, to register in full regularly, and small charities with more limited resources to register activity less regularly and in less details. But the proportionate approach requires a lot of careful consideration on how you would set the rules for such a sliding scale. For example, should a large charity lobbying for big government contracts, as many do, register as much as consultant lobbyists, or should they register as much as smaller charities? The idea of charging a fee to register was almost entirely rejected in evidence on the basis that this would create a barrier, or at worst, a deterrent to people seeking to engage with the Parliament and with government. So any additional costs, such as for a registrar or for software to create a modern register, would need to be met from the public purse. As ever, when there are financial considerations, members will need to consider whether the funds required are justified and will achieve the objectives of increased transparency, accountability and, as intended by some witnesses, an improvement in trust in the political process and politicians. We also looked at sanctions, with some arguing that naming and shaming lobbyists acting inappropriately would in and of itself have a powerful effect, curbing their ability to engage in future. But others suggested that for the bigger lobbying firms, nothing short of big financial penalties could curb behaviours. And that raises the question, in what circumstances should sanctions be imposed and by whom? We heard from some that there are issues with existing voluntary registers being too weak. They lack the ability to oblige information or to sanction effectively. Others suggested that a full statutory register in Scotland was a disproportionate effect to crack a nut. In response to the suggestion that a register would never provide the full picture of lobbying activity, those pushing for increased transparency suggested that a fuller, if still incomplete, picture would nonetheless be beneficial. Interesting developments elsewhere also informed us, with the National Assembly for Wales inquiry deciding Wales should stop short of a register, but rather look at other measures. Now, turning to the point that Mr Mason raised, I've tested the water. I've reviewed my own diary and have established a published copy of those diary entries I consider to be lobbying. Now, it proved very simple to do and to publish the parts of my diary. You can see the results, if you're interested, at lobbying.stewartstevenson.scot. I tweeted about that this morning, and interestingly enough, we've already had over 200 views of the information that I provided. So they're interested in me. I don't know if they'll be interested in anybody else in the chamber, but at least they're interested in me. But seriously, have a look at what I've done, and it's just a personal venture, nothing to do with the Parliament or the committee. Give me feedback, and that will inform the committee, and also help us as a committee see what really the effort is for the broader generality of members, rather than for perhaps one of your more technically illiterate members that perhaps might be myself. And members who want to do it for themselves in the short term, I'm quite happy to sit down and talk about how it's done. Now, I'm coming towards the end, a little bit more to say, but be warned, at the end of the day, when you do that, there's quite a lot of judgment calls to be made about what is or is not you're being lobbied. If you meet a group with a small campaign in your constituency, that can presumably be considered to be constituency casework and so needn't feature in a published record of lobbying contact. But if you meet them again and they have a local business represented there, or even a professional lobbyist with them, that will almost certainly tip them into you have to publish it. That's a view I would take. Members will note that committee members' contributions in this debate will largely consist of snippets of the views of stakeholders. They will be reading out 100-word statements from them. Now, these are not necessarily the views of the members themselves, but what we're trying to do as a committee is to bring the outside into the debate to the floor of the chamber. This matters to folk out there. It's not just about our own internal navel gazing. While we debate, I know, because I've looked, there are already live interchanges and debates on Facebook and Twitter, and the committee will look at these after the debate and see if that helps us understand. Now, that kind of completes the whistle-stop tour of the issues we've been tussling with. It's a complex issue altogether, a complex area. Passions can run high. We had one very, very spirited debate, which was actually between panellists. Fortunately, there was a neutral person sitting between the two of them, and you can look at the video if you want to. Now it's over to our colleagues here in the Parliament and people who are watching to help us understand what the correct balance between regulation and ensuring the Parliament remains open and accessible as it currently is. The committee is not set on its findings. We haven't attempted yet to reach consensus on most of, or many of the issues. So it genuinely is a chance today to influence what we will put in the report and make recommendations to you in due course. I thank you very much indeed for the extra time, Presiding Officer. I found it useful. Hopefully everyone else did as well.